Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're taking a close look at Black History Month, but with a specific focus. The 2025 theme, African Americans and labor. And trust me, this isn't just a deep dive into jobs. We're going to be looking at community building, activism, and of course, the fight for fair workplaces.
Yeah.
It's a really big story covering centuries.
Yeah, it is a massive story, and it's so fascinating too, because when you really start digging into it, you realize that the story of labor in America, well, it's really inseparable from the story of African Americans. I
Yeah.
mean, their contributions, you can't ignore them. They're woven into the very fabric of this nation.
True. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, like the very beginning, right? We're talking 1619, the first enslaved Africans arriving at Point Comfort, Virginia.
Yep. And what's interesting is that at first, they were treated as indentured servants, a lot like many of the European laborers coming to the colonies. But as time went on, things changed. It took a much darker turn.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. Why the switch to chattel slavery? I mean, was it all just about economics? Like, was that the main driver?
Well, economics played a huge part, that's for sure. As those indentured servants finished their terms, the demand for a more stable workforce, a workforce that could be controlled, that demand just kept growing. But it's deeper than that. It wasn't just about filling those labor needs. Creating a system where people were seen as property, as less than human, well, that was key to justifying the brutality of slavery.
It's hard to even imagine, to be honest. It's just chilling. And those slave ships, the conditions they endured, it's just horrific. I mean, the sources describe things that are difficult to even fathom.
Right. One account that really stuck with me was Olada Equiano's narrative. He described the stench below deck, people just packed together, the suffering. It was a deliberate attempt to break them, to erase their identity before they even set foot in America.
And it's just amazing. In the midst of all that dehumanization, there were still acts of resistance. Like the sources talk about mutinies on the ships. I mean, they weren't always successful, obviously, but still.
Exactly. Those acts of resistance, even if they were small, they show that the desire for freedom, that refusal to be completely subjugated, it never went away. It's a theme that keeps coming up throughout Black history. Okay, now fast forward. We're at the American Revolution. And this is where things get really, really complex.
Yeah, because now you have Black people fighting on both sides of the war, right? Hoping for freedom, but from different sources.
Exactly. Some saw the British as their path to freedom. Others fought for the American cause, hoping that a new nation would treat them better. And the story of Crispus Attucks, the first to die in the Boston Massacre, well, he's a great example of this complexity.
Right. He was a free Black man, and he became a symbol of the fight for liberty.
It's a powerful story,
Yeah.
because it shows how paradoxical the American Revolution really was. Here you have this fight for freedom from Britain, but at the same time, the fight for real equality within the brand new United States, well, that fight was just beginning.
And as the nation expanded westward, the whole issue of slavery, it became even more contentious, right? What was that like for Black Americans, especially those who are already free?
Well, the expansion of slavery westward, it really fueled the economy in the South, no doubt about that. But it also intensified the moral debate about slavery itself. You see, you have the abolitionist movement gaining strength in the North, and they're clashing head-on with the South, who's determined to protect their economic system. It was a powder keg.
And that's when the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 comes in, right? Even free Black people in the North, they were in danger of being captured and forced into slavery. The sources mention it, but I want to understand more about how it actually impacted people.
It was a terrifying time for Black communities. I mean, imagine living with the constant fear of being kidnapped, separated from your family, and shipped south. That's what the Fugitive Slave Act did. It created a climate of terror. And that's also what fueled the Underground Railroad. This network of secret routes, these safe houses, it was a lifeline for enslaved people desperate for freedom.
It's incredible. The bravery of everyone involved is just, I mean, it sounds like a spy thriller, but these were real lives at stake.
You're telling me. Those stories of escape and defiance, those individual acts of courage, they really show just how powerful the yearning for freedom was. Okay, but back to 1850 for a second. We got to talk about the compromise. It was a temporary fix, a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, and it couldn't hold back the conflict that was brewing.
Yeah, that's right. I remember learning about it, but honestly, it always felt kind of confusing. What was the Compromise of 1850 really about? Why couldn't it prevent the Civil War?
It was basically a bunch of laws meant to appease both sides of the slavery debate. California came into the Union as a free state, but to balance that out, they strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, and they allowed popular sovereignty, letting people in some territories decide whether or not to allow slavery. It was a balancing act,
Uh,
very delicate one, and it just crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions.
Sounds like they were just delaying the inevitable, kicking the can down the road, hoping the problem would magically disappear.
Pretty much. And then, boom, 1861. The nation explodes into the Civil War, a war that would change the course of American history forever.
And with the Civil War comes the Emancipation Proclamation, right? 1863. Lincoln declares enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. It's got to be one of the most pivotal moments in American history.
Monumental, definitely. It changed the moral landscape of the war, that's for sure. And it paved the way for slavery to finally be abolished. But it's important to remember, the Emancipation Proclamation, it had its limitations. It didn't apply to those border states that stayed loyal to the Union, and it didn't free every single enslaved person immediately. The fight for real liberation, well, it wasn't over just yet.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. It feels like a turning point, for sure, but at the same time, it's also the beginning of a whole new chapter in the struggle for Black equality.
Absolutely. And that next chapter, the one we call Reconstruction, it's often overlooked. But it's a period filled with both progress and, unfortunately, tragic setbacks.
Okay, let's get into that. What was Reconstruction actually like for Black Americans? What led to its ultimate downfall?
Reconstruction, which lasted roughly from 1865 to 1877, was a period of hope, a period of opportunity. Slavery was over, and formerly enslaved people, they wanted to rebuild their lives. They wanted to experience their newfound freedom, to be a part of the political process.
You see Black men voting, holding political office, working hard to create a more just and fair society. It's a glimpse of what could have been.
Yeah. And the Freedmen's Bureau, they played a huge role in all this. They provided education, healthcare, you name it, to help formerly enslaved people transition to a free life.
But like we all know, Reconstruction didn't last. It was a tragically short era. What happened? What brought it down?
Well, there was fierce resistance. White Southerners, many of them, they resented the changes that Reconstruction brought about. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they emerged during this time, and they used terror, violence, to intimidate Black people and undermine their newly gained rights.
It's just heartbreaking to think about those gains eroded so quickly. You have the rise of Jim Crow laws, the systematic disenfranchisement of Black voters. It almost feels like a deliberate attempt to undo all the progress that had been made.
And in a lot of ways, it was. The failure of Reconstruction set the stage for decades of segregation and inequality, especially in the South. And those effects, they were felt across the entire nation. But even facing these obstacles, Black communities, they didn't give up. They continued to resist, to build, to fight for their rightful place in American society.
Their resilience throughout all this is really a constant theme, isn't it? It's inspiring, but it also makes you realize just how much they had to overcome, how much they were up against.
No doubt about it. And speaking of overcoming obstacles, let's move into the early 20th century. This is when we see the Great Migration. Millions of Black people leaving the South, searching for better opportunities and escaping the harsh realities of Jim Crow.
It's a story filled with hardship, but also with incredible determination. What drove so many to leave everything behind and head north?
It was a push and pull, really. The South offered limited opportunities, rampant discrimination. Lynchings were a very real threat. And economic prospects, well, they were just bleak for many. But the North offered something different. It offered jobs in factories, a chance to escape the constant threat of violence, the hope of a better life for their children. It was a leap of faith for many.
And that mass movement of people, it reshaped the cultural and demographic landscape of the whole country, didn't it?
Absolutely. And even with the challenges of adjusting to new cities, facing new forms of discrimination, something incredible was happening. A cultural renaissance was blooming. I'm talking about the Harlem Renaissance, that explosion of Black art, music, literature, and intellectual thought that we saw emerge in the 1920s. It was a time of incredible creativity.
It's amazing to think about that flourishing of creativity happening right alongside the harsh realities of the Great Depression. It almost seems contradictory.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How did they find the will to create amidst all that hardship? It really speaks to the power of art as a form of resistance, a way to express joy and pain, a way to celebrate their culture, and to imagine a better future.
It's a testament to the resilience of Black communities, to their spirit, even in the face of economic despair.
It is. And it reminds us that Black history isn't just about struggle. It's about creativity, innovation, that constant pursuit of excellence. It's a multifaceted story. And, speaking of resilience, we can't forget how hard the Great Depression hit Black communities. I mean, existing inequalities, they were just magnified. And you had all this discrimination in hiring, so they were often the first to lose their jobs.
Yeah, Which makes the Harlem Renaissance even more impressive, you know? To have that kind of creativity and innovation during such tough times, that's really something. But I'm curious, with the New Deal, did that offer any real relief for Black Americans? I mean, the focus was on economic recovery, right?
Well, that's a tough question. It's complicated. See, on the one hand, the New Deal did create jobs for Black Americans through things like the Works Progress Administration, WPA. But then on the other hand, you still had these racial biases baked into the system. So even with these programs, Black workers often ended up with lower paying jobs, the jobs nobody else wanted.
Right, and the sources talk about how Black sharecroppers, I mean, a lot of them are barely surviving. They were excluded from a lot of the New Deal's agricultural programs, the ones that were supposed to help.
Exactly. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the one designed to help stabilize farm prices, well, it often benefited white landowners, but at the expense of Black sharecroppers, who ended up without land or income. It just shows you how these systemic inequalities, they can stick around, even in programs that are supposed to help people.
It proves that good intentions, they aren't always enough. You got to actively address those deep-rooted issues, you know? Otherwise, you're just repeating the same patterns of inequality over and over again.
Couldn't agree more. And then World War II breaks out. And once again, Black Americans face this paradox. They're fighting for democracy overseas, but back home, they're still dealing with segregation and discrimination. It's like this constant fight on two fronts.
Yeah, the sources mention this double V campaign, this idea of fighting for victory over fascism in Europe and victory over racism in America. It's such a powerful concept.
It really is. It captures the spirit of the time perfectly. Black soldiers served with honor, with distinction, but they came home to a country that still denied them basic rights. It was a slap in the face. And that fueled the growing civil rights movement. It laid the groundwork for the struggles for equality that would define the decades to come.
Speaking of struggles for equality, the fight for fair workplaces, that was a huge part of the broader movement, right? The sources highlighted the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which seemed like a really pivotal moment in that fight.
Oh, absolutely. Founded in 1925 by A. Philip Randolph, the Brotherhood was the first black labor union to be recognized by the American Federation of Labor, AFL. It was a huge victory, especially considering how much discrimination black workers faced back then.
I was reading about the Pullman porters. I mean, they were so essential to the railway industry, but they were denied basic rights and fair wages. It's like a perfect example of the broader struggle for Black economic justice.
It really is. These were the men who made sure passengers were comfortable on those long train journeys, but they were treated like second-class citizens. It's messed up. But Randolph, he understood how powerful collective bargaining could be. And he fought hard to improve their working conditions, to get them better pay, to have their contributions recognized. He was a tireless advocate for them.
And it wasn't just about the money, right? It was about respect, about being treated with dignity.
Exactly. The Brotherhood's fight was about challenging this whole idea that black labor was somehow less valuable, that they were somehow less deserving of fairness. It was about demanding recognition for their humanity, for the contributions they made to society.
And it's fascinating how intertwined the fight for labor rights was with the broader civil rights movement. The sources mention Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign back in 1967, which seemed to build on what Randolph had started.
That connection's super important. King understood that economic justice and racial justice, they went hand in hand. The Poor People's Campaign, which demanded economic rights for all Americans, regardless of race, was proof of that belief. It brought people from all walks of life together to fight for a more just society.
It shows how interconnected these issues are. You can't really address racial inequality without addressing economic inequality. They're two sides of the same coin.
You got it. And that connection, it goes all the way back to slavery. Think about it. Black labor built this nation's wealth, but they were exploited every step of the way. And even today, we still see wage gaps, discriminatory hiring practices, and a lack of access to capital for black entrepreneurs. It's a long, hard fight.
Makes you realize that the fight for economic justice, it's far from over. There's so much work left to be done to dismantle these systems, these barriers that keep people down.
And that's why the 2025 theme, African Americans and Labor, it encourages us to think broadly about what labor even means. It's not just about jobs that pay you money. It's about recognizing the value of all the work that goes into building and sustaining black communities.
Right. Think about social justice activists, volunteers, the people who build institutions within churches and social organizations. All that labor, whether it's paid or not, it's all essential. It's the fabric of society.
It's about recognizing all that unpaid labor, the kind that often falls on the shoulders of black women. The work they do to hold their communities together, to lift them up. Think about the mutual aid societies that emerged during slavery and continued through Jim Crow. They were lifelines for black communities facing constant oppression.
It really shows the power of community, of collective care, of resilience in the face of adversity.
You said it. And that story continues today with black activists, organizers, volunteers. They're leading the charge on issues like criminal justice reform, healthcare access, educational equity. They're the unsung heroes, working tirelessly behind the scenes to make the world a more just and equitable place.
And so much of that labor goes unnoticed, or it's undervalued by society. But without it, those communities wouldn't be able to survive, let alone thrive. It's the foundation.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to recognize and celebrate those contributions, to see how they fit into the bigger picture of African Americans and labor. It's about expanding our definition of work and valuing all the ways black people have contributed to this nation, economically, socially, in every way.
It's making me think about the role of black intellectuals and thought leaders, the people who've shaped the narrative, challenged the way we think. I'd love to explore that aspect of black history more deeply.
Great point. Their voices, their ideas, they've been so important in shaping the struggle for freedom and equality. We've talked about Du Bois and A. Philip Randolph, but there are so many others who deserve our attention.
The sources mentioned Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. They had some different perspectives on how black liberation could be achieved. I'd be fascinated to unpack those contrasting viewpoints.
That's what's so great about exploring black intellectual thought. You get this rich tapestry of viewpoints. Sometimes they clash, sometimes they complement each other, but they always push the conversation forward. Let's start with Booker T. Washington. He was a towering figure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
He's most famous for founding the Tuskegee Institute, right? Focused on vocational education for black students.
That's right. Washington believed that if black Americans were going to lift themselves up, they needed economic self-sufficiency. So he advocated for practical skills training. He really pushed the idea of black people building their own businesses, their own institutions.
But he also gave that Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895. It was controversial. It sounded like he was saying black people should just accept Jim Crow and focus on economic progress instead of demanding civil and political rights right away.
It was a pragmatic approach. He was operating in the reality of the Jim Crow South, remember. Washington thought that if black people could show their economic value, prove themselves to white society, then eventually they'd gain acceptance and achieve equality. It was a long game.
But some folks, like W.E.B. Du Bois, they criticized that stance pretty heavily. They thought it was way too conciliatory.
Du Bois, he was a brilliant scholar and activist. He argued for a more confrontational approach. He believed black people needed higher education, and he demanded full civil and political rights, no compromises. He saw Washington's approach as accepting a lower status, as perpetuating the system of inequality.
So you have these two giants of black intellectual thought, and they've got these contrasting visions of the future. And it's a debate that's still relevant today, isn't it? This question of how to achieve racial equality in a society that's built on systemic racism. That's a tough one.
And it's a debate that often oversimplifies their positions. Both Washington and Du Bois, they were complex figures, and they dedicated their lives to uplifting black communities. They might have disagreed on tactics, but the end goal was the same. A just and equitable society where black people could thrive.
Now, what about Marcus Garvey? He was born in Jamaica, and he became a prominent figure in the 1920s with a very different vision.
Garvey was a charismatic leader. He really championed Pan-Africanism and black nationalism. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which called for black people all over the world to unite and create their own independent nation in Africa. It was a bold vision.
His message of black self-reliance, of separation from white society, it really struck a chord with a lot of people who felt like progress in America was just too slow.
Definitely. Garvey believed that real liberation could only happen through complete independence. He argued that black people were their own nation with their own unique culture and history, and they should control their own destiny. He didn't see integration as the answer.
His Back to Africa movement, it was inspiring to some, but it also caused a lot of controversy.
It did. His vision of this mass exodus to Africa, it never actually happened. But Garvey's impact on black consciousness, it was huge. He instilled a sense of pride, of self-determination in black communities all over the world.
So we've got Washington, Du Bois, and Garvey. Three figures, each with their own distinct, sometimes conflicting ideas about the path to Black liberation. It shows the richness and diversity of Black intellectual thought.
It does. And it reminds us that there's no one Black perspective. It's a whole spectrum of viewpoints and approaches shaped by individual experiences, historical context, and all the changing social and political dynamics.
It's really fascinating to see how these ideas are still relevant today, how they inform discussions about race, identity, and justice in the 21st century. It's a conversation that's still going on, and there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. And as we get into the civil rights era, we meet another influential figure who really challenged the status quo and pushed the boundaries of conventional thinking, Malcolm X.
His journey is particularly interesting because he went through such profound transformation. His thinking and beliefs really evolved over time.
You're right. Malcolm X started out as a powerful spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. He advocated for Black separatism and self-defense. He argued that Black people had the right to protect themselves against white aggression. It was a radical stance for the time.
And his message resonated with a lot of people, especially those who were tired of waiting for integration and frustrated with the constant violence they faced.
He was a direct challenge to Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach. Malcolm X believed that turning the other cheek just emboldened the oppressors.
His speeches were powerful, uncompromising. He talked about Black pride, self-determination, rejecting the white power structure. He wasn't afraid to speak truth to power, no matter the consequences.
But later in his life, Malcolm X's views shifted. He left the Nation of Islam, went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and came to embrace a more inclusive vision of Islam, one that went beyond race.
That pilgrimage seems like it was a turning point for him. He started to see the fight for Black liberation as part of a global movement for human rights. It became bigger than just America.
Exactly. He realized that oppression took many forms, and that solidarity among all oppressed people, that was the key to achieving real justice. His message started to focus on unity and understanding, but he never stopped advocating for the rights of Black people.
It's tragic that his life was cut short in 1965 when he was assassinated. The world lost a powerful voice that day.
No doubt. Malcolm X was silenced way too soon. But his impact, it's still felt today. He challenged the status quo, pushed the boundaries of the conversation, and inspired generations of activists to come.
His evolution is a reminder that growth and change are possible, even when faced with what seem like impossible challenges. It's a testament to the power of embracing nuance and complexity.
And speaking of embracing complexity, we can't forget about the role of Black women in all this. In the labor movement, the fight for social justice, they've been there from the very beginning. But their contributions are often overlooked. It's time to give them the recognition they deserve.
You're right. We can go all the way back to slavery, where Black women were working in the fields, in the homes of their enslavers, and in their own communities. They faced double the burden. Racism and sexism is hard to even imagine.
And yet they found ways to resist, to create networks of support, to fight for their families and their communities. They understood that their freedom was tied to the freedom of their people as a whole. They couldn't be free until everyone was free.
And during Jim Crow, Black women were still vital. They often worked in domestic service or low-wage jobs just to keep their families afloat.
But they also became active in organizations like the NAACP and the National Council of Negro Women. They were pushing for social change, advocating for the rights of Black women and children. They knew their voices mattered. They knew they had to be a part of the fight for equality.
The sources mention Addie Wyatt. She was an incredible labor leader who fought for better working conditions and better pay for Black women in the meatpacking industry. She was a real trailblazer.
She was. Breaking down barriers in the male-dominated world of unions, that was no easy feat. She understood that collective bargaining was essential for Black workers, especially Black women, who often faced the worst of it, the most exploitation. She was a force to be reckoned with.
Wyatt also got the whole intersectional thing. She advocated for reproductive rights and challenged gender discrimination within the labor movement itself. She knew that the fight for equality had to include everybody.
Right on. Her story shows that true progress needs a more holistic approach, one that recognizes how race, gender, and class, they all intersect, they all affect each other. You can't ignore one while focusing on another.
It's a testament to the strength of Black women, to their leadership, and to their unwavering commitment to social justice. They never gave up.
Now, as we move towards the end of the 20th century, Black intellectuals and activists, they were wrestling with a new set of complexities. The civil rights movement had achieved major victories, but the legacy of racism and inequality that was still deeply embedded in the fabric of America.
It was a strange time, a time of progress, but also a time of disillusionment. Some things had gotten better, but that promise of true equality, it still felt out of reach.
It did. And that's when thinkers like bell hooks and Cornel West stepped onto the scene. They offer these critical perspectives on race, class, and gender in a rapidly changing world.
Hooks, she was a feminist scholar and activist. She challenged the patriarchal ideas within the feminist movement itself. She argued that Black women's experiences, their voices, were being marginalized. She stressed the importance of intersectionality, this idea that our identities are complex and that these systems of oppression, they work together, they reinforce each other.
And West, he's a philosopher, a public intellectual. He's written extensively about how racial inequality persists in America. He's not afraid to make people uncomfortable, to force us to confront the hard truths about our past and our present.
Both Hooks and West, they emphasize the importance of critical consciousness, of taking action to dismantle these systems of oppression. Their work is vital for understanding the ongoing fight for racial and social justice.
It's a reminder that the fight for liberation, it's never really over. It needs constant attention, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. We can't get complacent.
So, as we reflect on this journey through Black history, with a focus on labor and the contributions of Black intellectuals, what are some of the key takeaways that really stand out to you? What resonates the most?
For me, it's that resilience, that never-ending fight for freedom and equality, even in the face of incredible obstacles. It's also about recognizing that there are many different schools of thought within Black communities. There's a whole range of perspectives and approaches to achieving liberation. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It's about seeing how everything's connected, how race, class, gender, labor rights, it's all woven together in this struggle for a more just and equitable society. We can't just address these issues separately. We need a more holistic approach. It's all got to work together.
And Black history, it's not just about the past, it's a living story. It's still unfolding, and we're all a part of shaping its future.
That's a powerful thought. And it leads perfectly into our final segment, where we'll delve deeper into the 2025 theme, African Americans and Labor. We'll explore what it means for us today and what it means for the future. It really is amazing when you think about it. I mean, the theme of labor, it runs through every single era of Black history. But like you said, it's not just about looking back. The 2025 theme, African Americans and Labor, it makes us think about how work itself has changed, how it's evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen these huge shifts, haven't we, in the economy, technology, in the very idea of what work means. And for Black communities, those changes have had a big impact. They've created some real opportunities, but also some serious challenges.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What does that look like today for Black communities, I mean? What are some of the specific opportunities and challenges you're talking about?
Well, think about the gig economy, the digital world, entrepreneurship. These are areas that hold so much potential for Black Americans. But there are also some unique hurdles they face.
You're right. We're definitely seeing more Black-owned businesses these days, more tech startups, creative ventures, which is incredible. But I know there are still those systemic barriers. Getting access to capital, to networks, to resources, it can be a lot harder.
That's a key point. Even with all the progress, the wealth gap, it's still there. And it's not just about celebrating individual success stories, as important as those are. It's about addressing the systems that create these disparities in the first place. That's the bigger challenge.
So what can we actually do? How do we move beyond just talking about it and actually make a difference? What needs to happen?
It takes intentional action. It takes supporting Black-owned businesses, advocating for policies that promote economic equity, and investing in education and training programs that give Black Americans the tools they need to thrive in this new economy. We have to be proactive.
And the sources talked about how Black professionals, teachers, nurses, musicians, lawyers, you name it, they've always been at the forefront of organizing for better conditions. Is that still a big part of the solution?
Oh, for sure. Collective action is still crucial. Unions are still relevant, absolutely.
Right.
But we're also seeing new ways of organizing popping up. Online activism, movements like Black Lives Matter, they're putting pressure on the system, demanding change.
It's about those intersections we keep coming back to. Race, gender, labor, they're all connected. You can't just address one without considering the others. It's got to be a more holistic approach.
And that brings up a really important question. What does a truly equitable workplace look like? I mean, it's got to be about more than just equal pay, right? It's about childcare, healthcare, family leave policies, all these things that disproportionately impact women, especially Black women, who are often the ones carrying the weight of caregiving responsibilities. It's about the whole picture.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the value of all labor, including the work that doesn't come with a paycheck. How do we support that? Not just with words, but in concrete ways. That's the challenge.
It's a complex issue for sure. But, when we look back at this history, at all those hard-fought battles, it gives us a sense of what's possible. It gives us a roadmap.
It shows us that when people come together, when they demand change, when they refuse to accept things as they are, that's when real progress happens. And it's up to us to connect those struggles of the past to what's happening today, to use that knowledge to inform our actions and keep pushing for a better future.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. We're not just watching history unfold. We're a part of it. We're shaping it. So I ask you, what will your contribution be? What role will you play in the fight for economic and social justice? How will you use this knowledge, this understanding, to help create a more equitable future for everyone? That's the question we all have to answer.